Hello and welcome back to Oddtober, the month of the year that we dedicate to talking about all things Oddworld related. And this time we've got something particularly interesting we're taking a look at, because we're going to be delving into all of the games that never actually saw the light of day and ended up cancelled. Of course, with the games we're talking about today being far from finished products, we're not going to be able to actually review them, and we're more so just going to be generally talking about them and discussing what they would have been like if they actually would have been made. So, with all that out of the way, let's get on with the first cancelled Oddworld game. So the first cancelled game I want to look at is Oddworld Hand of Odd, and this one by far has the most information for us to dig into. In fact, it's the only one that was far enough along into development that it actually had some very early video tests created for it. Before we get into that though, let's give you a basic idea of what Hand of Odd was supposed to be. It was going to be an Oddworld real-time strategy game where the two factions would have been the Tree Huggers, these being the native species like Medokans, Elam, Meep, Fuzzles and the like, and then we had the Land Muggers, who were the Industrialists, these being Gluckans, Vikers, Sligs and captive Medokans. Straight away I actually think this is a pretty good idea. By the time this game started development, Munchs Odyssey was also in production, meaning that most of the main Oddworld species were already a part of the series in some capacity. So each faction would have had a wealth of characters to utilise. The whole aspect of industry versus nature would have probably played a big role, with the industrialists gaining power for destroying the environment and the naturalists gaining power for taking down the industrialisation. There could have even been an element of gameplay where the industrialists could capture Medokans to use as a labour force, and the natural faction could free captured Medokans, causing a constant battle for power. There's a ton of concept art for Hand of Odd, some showing different structures you would have been able to build, like the Splinters tree recycler, which probably would have transformed trees into a resource for the industrialists. But then we also have artwork showing the two factions going into battle, with Medokans riding on Elams and Sligs riding on what look like big versions of a Bolamite. What's particularly intriguing about Hand of Odd though is that it's the only cancelled Oddworld game that has any kind of video footage. These clips were probably intended for internal use for the developers to refer to during development, or it's possible that they were used as early publicity to give journalists an impression of what the game was going to be like. But either way, they actually show what the game could have been like in motion. It shows buildings like Alf's Rehab and Tea, which maybe would have been used to cure brew sickness or something, herds of scrabs running through the wild, which might have been an enemy to both of the factions, or maybe they could have been used by the industrialists to make scrab cakes in order to get moolah, which might have been their main resource in order for them to make buildings and units. Judging from this footage, it also seems like we would have been able to have zoomed way into the action and see things close up, which would have been really cool. It's interesting because we've never seen anything on this sort of scale within the Oddworld universe before, and it's been suggested that after Hand of Odd was scrapped, they actually took some of the ideas that were going to be used in the game and implemented them into Munchs Odyssey, which explains why there's moments in that game where you command a small army of Medokans who use laser weapons to take down groups of Sligs. It's like they took the idea of controlling units in an RTS game and tried to put it into a 3D platformer style game, which maybe didn't work quite as well as they intended. Another interesting detail with Hand of Odd is that in 2011, 3 years before the release of New and Tasty, it was stated that Just Add Water, the developer of New and Tasty, was reviving Hand of Odd. However, this never actually happened, and as far as I'm aware, it was never stated exactly why. In fact, the relationship between Just Add Water and Oddworld inhabitants seemingly ended overnight for unknown reasons. After the release of New and Tasty, it was said that the relationship between the two companies was ended because the physical distance between them made development difficult. But I personally think that this isn't entirely true, especially considering that Oddworld Sligstorm was co-developed by many different studios from all across the world. Either way though, the rebooted Just Add Water version of Hand of Odd was also cancelled. Third time's the charm though, right? The next game we're talking about also has quite a lot of information for us to dig into, but unfortunately no video this time around. So join me as we talk about the Brutal Ballad of Fangus Clot, which by the way is an awesome title. The Brutal Ballad of Fangus Clot, otherwise known as simply Oddworld Fangus, was supposed to be a mixture of third-person and first-person shooter, very similarly to how Oddworld Stranger's Wrath was. In fact, it most likely would have used the exact same engine as Stranger's Wrath, and was probably going to be the next game in the Oddworld series after Stranger. What makes Fangus different though is that it apparently would have been way darker and had more political overtones, with the overall aesthetic of the game being inspired by Russia. Unlike the Stranger who doesn't like guns, Fangus would have used any means necessary to achieve his goal and actively used guns to kill his enemies. He also would have been even bigger than the Stranger, as seen in this concept art, and this would have probably have made the game feel very different to any other Oddworld game. The story would have been about Fangus being captured by an evil cat-like species who start building factories in order to produce drugs. Fangus and the other natives to the area are used as entertainment, forced to take part in pit fights against all manner of creatures. And when Fangus is bitten by a creature that gives him rabies, he decides to try and escape and free all of the other captives before he inevitably dies to his condition. We don't know exactly why this game was cancelled, and to be honest, out of all of these cancelled games, this is probably the one I would most like to see get a second chance. But one of the reasons for the cancellation could have been a lack of publisher interest. With Oddworld inhabitants not wanting to work with EA again after Stranger's Wrath and the poor promotion that game received, they struggled to find anyone to fund another game. They did eventually get Majesco Entertainment on board, but with Fangus being developed as an original Xbox game and the Xbox 360 releasing soon, Oddworld inhabitants shelved the project because of publisher interference, before completely disbanding as a company until the resurgence in 2010 when they re-released all of their old games independently. The next games on our agenda actually have far less information for us to dig through than the two previous games that we've talked about, but this next one is interesting just based on its concept alone, and is something that I'd like to see Oddworld inhabitants revisit at some point. So, let's talk about Oddworld Sligstorm. Outside of some general information about Sligstorm, we don't have anything tangible to dive into here. There's no video or even concept art for this, which is disappointing given how good of an idea it is. Because of the lack of solid information out there, it's quite difficult to tell exactly what this game would have been. My understanding of the situation is that Sligstorm was in extremely early development, maybe even more so just in its conceptual stage, at around the same time that Munchs Odyssey started development. And the plan was to re-release Abe's Odyssey and Abe's Exodus as a double pack, and to include a brand new short game with this pack to incentivize more people to buy it. This short game would have been Sligstorm, and would have been a similar length to the Slig Barracks area in Abe's Exodus. It would have been about an albino Slig born within the Slig Barracks, who, because of his different appearance, would have been shunned or maybe even killed by the other Sligs. So the game is about this Slig attempting to break out of the facility and escape. One of the things about this that would have been really cool to have seen is the simple fact that having a Slig as a main character would have been really interesting. Plus, playing through the Slig barracks from another perspective and getting to see more of it would have been really cool too. And plus, it seems like it would have had a theme of racism, which would have been interesting to see the Oddworld universe tackle. They did later do this in Stranger's Wrath to a degree, but I feel like it could have been even more impactful with Sligstorm due to using a species that we're already familiar with. The reason for this game's cancellation is most likely due to the fact that Munchs Odyssey was so troubled during development, which probably resulted in the Abe's Odyssey and Abe's Exodus double pack being scrapped, and therefore Sligstorm also needing to be scrapped due to its short length. This of course meaning that it couldn't be released as an individual game. Nowadays this wouldn't be so much of an issue because they could have just released it independently on digital stores. But back then, games needed physical releases, and a short game wouldn't have been worth the manufacturing costs. Another reason for the game's cancellation is that at the time, Munchs Odyssey and Hand of Odd were being developed for the PS2. Making another 2D game for the PS1 would have been seen as maybe a slight waste of time, and plus, making 3 games at the same time would have been a huge strain on resources. It's obviously a shame that not only will we never see Sligstorm, but it's also a shame that this Abe's Odyssey and Exodus double pack didn't ever happen. Supposedly it would have had a behind the scenes bonus CD, which would have been super interesting because nothing like that really existed at the time. The next thing we're talking about would have actually have been a direct sequel to Oddworld Munchs Odyssey titled Munchs Exodus, which honestly I do remember expecting. Just because Abe had his own Exodus game, it only made sense for Munch to get his own one too, but clearly it wasn't meant to be. Munchs Exodus probably would have featured gameplay extremely similar to Munchs Odyssey. Maybe it would have been more fine-tuned, but it probably would have used many of the same ideas presented in the original game. There's literally only one piece of concept art for this game, which features a place called Mar Spa, which is where Munch would have spent the game getting to in order to get the Gabbit eggs retrieved in Munchs Odyssey to hatch. This game was clearly cancelled very, very early in development, and this was most likely due to the negative feedback to Munchs Odyssey. So far, this is the only cancelled game that I'm okay with us not having seen. I'm not a fan of Munchs Odyssey, and I think the Oddworld inhabitants made the right choice in scrapping this whole idea and creating Stranger's Wrath instead. I do hope we eventually get reintroduced to Munch in a future Oddworld game though, maybe with him having a more minor role than what he had in Munchs Odyssey. It would be nice to see how he's getting on after all this time. Next up we have the cancelled game known as Oddworld Squeaks Odyssey, and this one is particularly interesting because this was supposed to be the 3rd Oddworld Quintology game, with the Oddworld Quintology being the main series of games that progressed the overall story forward. The first of these games was obviously Abe's Odyssey, and the second one was Munch's Odyssey, so the implication here would have been that Abe and Munch would have met a new character called Squeak, and gradually built up a resistance group to fight the Gluckons. Squeaks Odyssey was planned to be the next game created after the release of Stranger's Wrath, maybe with it being developed alongside the Brutal Ballad of Fangus Clot. However, there's not even a single bit of concept art that's from this game. Well, that is outside of this one image that could be from Squeaks Odyssey, and might even be a picture of Squeak himself. It's not confirmed that this is definitely the case though, and this could be more concept art from Fangus. After all, it does look fairly similar to some of the art we've seen from that game. Squeaks Odyssey would have supposedly been about robotic life support systems that have been created by the Vikers, and they would use these to basically recycle body parts from dead creatures and turn them into workforces or security forces. Another use for these devices would have been to recycle injured inhabitants and make them work by using the robotic body parts, probably against their will. Squeak would have been one of the creatures in one of these robotic suits. He probably would have been very small and unable to do much on his own, but would have had the ability to use different robotic suits to navigate different areas and probably do different kinds of combat. There's apparently an ongoing issue with misinformation about this game, where people think that Squeak was going to be a creature called a brain slug. However, this all stemmed from a joke made on a Dear Alf forum, which used to be a regular section on the Oddworld website where Alf the Madocan would answer fan questions. But often he would quite clearly not know exactly what he was talking about, and when this joke he made was taken seriously, all of this misinformation about the game was spread. The final game we've got left to talk about was actually the 4th game in the Quintology, titled Oddworld Nod's Odyssey. So, let's take a look at what we know about it. Well, actually, there's nothing to say here. Not just because there's no information about Nod's Odyssey, but also because it's not real. It was started as a rumour by a fan of the series and eventually was so widespread that it had its own article on Wikipedia, which spread the rumour even more. I myself remember seeing this and believing that it was real, so I would imagine a lot of hardcore Oddworld fans are the same. The rumour was finally put to rest when Lorne Lanning, the co-founder of Oddworld Inhabitants and director of most of the Oddworld games, outright said in an interview that it was fake. I figured I would mention it here though because I legitimately thought that this was real up until doing research for this video. But that sums up every cancelled Oddworld game. While many of them are very interesting ideas and I would have loved to have seen them get made, especially with Sligstorm and Fangus, it does highlight an ongoing issue that Oddworld Inhabitants have always had. They always seemed to want to turn Oddworld into this massive franchise with multiple games being made at the same time, and I think this ambition led to disaster. The team clearly wasn't that big and didn't have the funding to be able to pull that off. So because of being spread so thinly and having a lack of direction, it probably wound up with the games that they did manage to finish lacking in quality. This is mostly seen with Munchs Odyssey, but honestly it seems to still be an issue even to this day. It was reported that Just Add Water were developing 4 to 5 Oddworld games all at the same time, and while 2 of those might have been the remasters of Munchs Odyssey and Stranger's Wrath, that's still an entire remake of Abe's Odyssey which turned out to be new and tasty, and 2 other unknown projects, one of which was probably Hand of Odd, on top of all of that. So it's not surprising that some of the projects they were working on ended up being cancelled. Hopefully this has changed with the release of Soulstorm and they're now only working on one game at a time, because I would hate to see them get put into a similar situation to where they were in 2004 when they had to disband after the creation of Stranger's Wrath. But that wraps up this video. I hope you enjoyed watching it and maybe even learned something too. I know I definitely did making it. I hadn't seen a lot of this concept art and I didn't even know that Nod's Odyssey was completely fake. Just for full transparency, this isn't actually every single cancelled Oddworld game, and a few others have been vaguely mentioned before, like a mobile one called Oddworld Slave Circus, but there's so little information about these ones that they're hardly worth talking about. But with that out of the way, let me know in the comments what your favourite of these cancelled Oddworld games are, and which ones you would like to see actually get made at some point. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like, subscribe to see more stuff like this coming soon, and I'll see you next time. Bye!